Blessed to be with Todd Nettleton, the voice of the Martyrs, and thank you for joining me today, Todd.
It is my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. It's great to be able to talk with you about really serious issues about Christian persecution that's going around in the world. And you've got a great website I've looked at many times, persecution.com. And is it just that you deal with mainly Christian persecution or other kinds of persecution?
Our ministry is dealing with Christians who are persecuted for their faith. So that is our DNA. That our founder, Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, was a persecuted Christian. He spent 14 years in prison in Communist Romania. His wife spent 3 years in prison, including many of those months in a labor camp, helping to build the Danube Canal. That was one of her work assignments while she was in prison there. So from the very first days, our ministry has existed to serve Christians like the Wurmbrands were, Christians who are in prison for their faith, who are beaten for their faith. And today we're actively doing that in more than 70 countries around the world.
Yeah, and so Voice of the Martyrs has been in existence for how many years now?
1967. So we are 56 years.
For quite a while here. So, and as far as your involvement with Voice of the Martyrs, you started with Voice of the Martyrs, what year?
1998. So I just celebrated my 25th anniversary here at VOM.
Okay. Well, it's too bad that we really have to, talk about this persecution issue. It's very serious. And I know you have concerns, a lot of Christian persecution around the world. I think of India being one of the places of real concern that's been in the news a lot, with President Biden going to be going to visit with Prime Minister Modi sometime here very soon. Prime Minister Modi has been to the White House as well. But what is your concern about what's happening in India about Christian persecution, and maybe some of maybe there might be a concern that Prime Minister Modi might have some reservations about speaking out about this?
Well, if you look into Prime Minister Modi's background, he came up within the Hindu nationalist RSS movement in India. That is a part of the foundation of his leadership, and it's part of the foundation of his government. Is we want India to be a Hindu country. If you're not a Hindu, there's really not a place for you. In fact, there are government ministers who have talked about India literally being Hindu soil, like the soil under our feet is Hindu soil. You shouldn't be walking on it if you're not a Hindu. And so, as obviously from Voice of the Martyrs perspective, that affects how Christians are treated. But if you look at the broader society, it affects how Muslims are treated. It affects how Sikhs are treated. And they do not have a philosophy of sort of religious pluralism at all. They have this Hindu nationalist philosophy. And one of the things that has happened is that has changed, even going down to the village level, how Christians are treated. What happens if you want to change your faith from Hinduism to something else, to Christianity, to Islam, to whatever? How does that work? Do you have the freedom to do that? All of those things have gone downhill from a religious freedom perspective since Prime Minister Modi took power. And I don't think they would see that as a bug. They would see that as a feature. Like that's their goal, is to make India a Hindu nation. So that's one of the things that concerns us. And as you mentioned, Prime Minister Modi was just recently in Washington, D.C. There was a lot of talk that, yes, we are going to address these subjects, these human rights abuses, but we're not going to do it publicly. We're going to kind of do that behind closed doors, and we don't want to embarrass anyone. And so I hope those conversations happened, but we don't know if they did or not, because obviously we weren't behind those closed doors. And so we don't know if that was really brought to the fore in the midst of talking about, hey, we need you as an ally against China, and hey, we want to have economic development. We want to profit off of Indian businesses. I wonder if our brothers and sisters who are suffering for their faith were part of the conversation.
And about the anti-conversion law, can you explain to our audience about more of the details about what this is all about?
So an anti-conversion law is, right now they have them in 12 states of India. Prime Minister Modi's government has sort of talked about the idea of a national anti-conversion law. So far, that has not happened, thankfully. That would violate the Indian Constitution, but I don't know if that would be a problem for them or not. But in these states where there are anti-conversion laws, they are used essentially as a weapon against the church, against religious minorities. And when you hear talk about them, or when they are presented, it is, hey, we don't want people to be bribed to change their faith. We don't want them to be threatened into changing their faith. And I think all of us would say, yeah, that's true. We don't want that. We don't want bribery. We don't want threats. But when you actually get into how these laws are carried out and how they affect the people on the ground in these states, they are used as a weapon. For instance, in one state, the anti-conversion law says, if I want to talk to my friend about changing his faith, so as a Christian, if I want to, share the gospel with someone, if I want to share a Bible with someone, I need to go to the magistrate 6 months before I have that conversation with my friend. And I need to register the fact that I'm going to talk to my friend in 6 months about changing his religion. That's ludicrous. I mean, none of us are going to talk about, plan ahead 6 months to have a conversation. But that's one of the restrictions of one of these state laws. That's one example of how these are used. So then if you come to somebody and they are having a conversation about faith, you can almost guarantee they didn't go to the magistrate 6 months ago and register the conversation. So you can arrest them. Hey, wait, you didn't follow the law. You're not doing this right. That's the kind of obstacle that this puts in the way of our Christian brothers and sisters in India. And that's just one example.
And as far as pastors being arrested, what's happening in the churches with these Hindu extremists?
Hindu extremists are coming into churches, and we're talking about multiple churches every week. And we are seeing church meetings, church services raided by Hindu nationalists. Sometimes they will beat the pastor. Sometimes they will call the police and try to get the pastor arrested. And there is very little pushback or very little penalty for them for doing this. And what often happens under these anti-conversion laws is there isn't really a need for evidence to get someone arrested. It is simply an accusation. Hey, they offered me rice in return for changing my faith. Hey, they tried to convert me by force. The Christian then gets arrested, and sure, maybe 6 months from now, they'll be set free. The judge will say, hey, there's no evidence of that. That didn't really happen that way. But they've been in jail for 6 months. They may have lost their house. Their family has obviously suffered during that 6 months of time. So it is used as a weapon, and the bar is so low that almost anyone can get arrested if one of these Hindu nationalists simply points a finger and says, hey, that guy broke the law.
What would Voice of the Martyrs have to say to President Biden about this issue and his upcoming conversations with Prime Minister Modi?
Advocacy is not the primary focus of Voice of the Martyrs, so it's not something that we spend a lot of time and energy on. I would say to the Biden administration, just as I would have said to the Trump administration or the Obama or the Bush administration, make this part of the conversation. When you're there with Prime Minister Modi, make sure that religious freedom is one of the topics you discuss. And yes, there are things we need to discuss about China, and there are things that we want to work with India on, but let's make sure that religious freedom is on the table, and it is something that is brought up in these meetings.
Well, I know several concerns regarding about how to deal with India on this matter. Trade issues, relationships. I mean, I don't know how President Biden can enforce this issue. I know that he has condemned Christian persecution in general, but I have no evidence specific any policies that are in place right now, and wanting to know about what can be done more, in that situation.
I think one of the things that would make a difference is if the State Department did label India as a country of particular concern. When they released their annual religious freedom report, they have it's been recommended that India would be a country of particular concern, but for the last several years, they have left them off of that list. And I think it is a matter of, I think they would say maybe bigger fish to fry. We need to talk about economic development. We need to talk about, military cooperation. So we don't want to offend them by giving them this designation. The thing about giving the designation is it opens some doors to some sanctions. It opens some doors for government action to kind of put some teeth behind that. But even the mention of it, and when the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom has recommended CPC status for India, you can look in the Indian press and it lights a fire under them. They are all kinds of upset about that even it would be talked about giving them that CPC designation. So I think that would be a very practical step forward that, again, does open the door for some sanctions. It does open the door for some teeth behind that, but it also sends a very clear message that, hey, we are paying attention. And this is important. This is important to us enough that even if it offends you, we're going to say, yes, there is Christian persecution. There is religious persecution in India.
And once again, CPC stands for?
Country of particular concern. That is one of the designations by the State Department of countries where religious freedom is violated repeatedly and regularly for the people there.
If you were at the State Department today, what would you say? What would you bring up?
Again, advocacy is not a real focus for Voice of the Martyrs. And so, I think I would say the same thing as about India. Let's make sure religious freedom, when we have conversations with leaders from other nations, let's make sure religious freedom is a part of that conversation.
Okay. I know there are many other countries that Christian persecution is happening. I also think about Nigeria. What is happening in Nigeria about persecution of Christians?
Nigeria it's a fascinating country because it is more or less 50-50 Muslim and Christian, but in the north, it is very much heavily majority Muslim. In the south, it is more predominantly Christian. And so we see attacks in Nigeria, particularly in the northern part of the country. I think one of the sad things to me is that our news media no longer reports on the attacks. Even quite large attacks in Nigeria have become such a regular occurrence that it's not news anymore when it happens. It's just like, oh yeah, there was another attack. That is, I hope that kind of represents to us the reality for Christians in northern Nigeria, that attacks are such a regular part of life that it's not even news anymore when it happens. And it's going to be interesting. A new president has just taken authority in Nigeria. It's going to be interesting to see how he responds to Boko Haram, to some of the other terrorist groups that are active in northern Nigeria. Every candidate, every president in Nigeria promises to be the one who can solve this problem, the one who can protect Christians and protect peace and harmony. So we will see if this new president has some different ideas and hopefully some better ideas than his predecessors to protect Christians in northern Nigeria.
Regarding physical violence, is there much more physical violence towards Christians in Nigeria than in India?
That is a great question. I think there are probably more people being killed in Nigeria, but physical violence is a regular occurrence in India as well. Less people, I would say, being martyred for their faith, but certainly being beaten up, being assaulted. Those things would happen in both countries on a pretty regular basis. Okay.
Yeah, that was my understanding. A lot more brutality as far as the way Christians are being dealt with in Nigeria. But there's also concern about Christian persecution in many other countries. About China, what is your concerns for Voice of the Martyrs?
China is a country that even in the last 5 years has gotten significantly harder on Christians. They have changed several laws. They have outlawed, for instance, selling Bibles online. That is no longer legal in China. All of the Bible distribution is handled, at least the legal Bible distribution is handled through the Three Self Church, the state-approved religious organization there in China. What has happened is the elevation of President Xi to almost a godlike being, to the point that literally church leaders have been told, hey, we see that you have a picture of Jesus at the front of your sanctuary. We need you to take that down. You need to put up a picture of President Xi. Hey, we know that you like to open your service by singing Amazing Grace. We need to stop singing Amazing Grace, and we need to open every service with a Communist Party song. Those types of controls and those types of pressure tactics against the church in China is something that has become a regular occurrence in China under President Xi. This is now not a provincial issue. It is a national issue. And what I mean by that is 20 years ago, when I was pretty fresh here at Voice of the Martyrs, you could look at one province of China and say, wow, there's a lot of persecution there. They really are cracking down on the church. But then you might look at another province, maybe even close by, and say, hey, the church there is operating without a lot of interference, without a lot of persecution. That provincial government is pretty much leaving the church alone. That is not how it is today at all. It is being handed down from Beijing. It's being handed down by the national government, and every province is expected to fall in line. Every province is expected to control religious expression, to control religion and how it is practiced in their province. And that's orders from Beijing that have to be carried out. They can't be ignored by the provincial government.
Regarding that province that's referred to as also East Turkestan, I don't know how you pronounce it. Is it Xinjiang province?
Xinjiang is how I've always heard it.
Province. So the Uyghur issue has been in the news a lot. And from my understanding, this area there used to be a lot of Christian influence. What is your awareness of as far as Christian presence amongst the Uyghur people?
Well, the good news is that there are Christians among the Uyghurs, and there are Christian Uyghurs. In fact, Voice of the Martyrs has supported some Christian Uyghurs over the years that are active in ministry, active in work in that part of the world. If you are a Christian and a Uyghur, you have two strikes against you, because the Chinese government does not want the growth of the church, and they do not want the Uyghurs as well. So it is important for the world to pay attention to what is happening. When you have 1 million people locked in concentration camps simply because of the color of their skin, simply because of their DNA, it is an appalling thing. And it is shocking to me how little attention it gets. It is shocking to me that Muslim countries in that region are not banging the drum to let the world know how China is treating the Uyghurs, how China is treating its Muslim population. But it is yet another example of how the Chinese Communist Party thinks of religious freedom. They want to control the hearts and minds of the people. They want you to wake up every morning and think, how can I be a good member of the party? How can I serve the interests of the party today? And so as Christians, if we wake up and think, how can I honor Jesus today? They don't want you to think that. They want you to be thinking about the Communist Party. They want to control the hearts and minds of the people. And that is true of Christians. That is true of Muslims. And it's probably the most eye-opening example of it is how they are treating the Uyghur people in Western China.
And what reports do you have about what's been happening in the concentration camps as far as, human rights violations?
I don't think we have reports specific to VOM, but there have been horrific reporting about the way women are treated, the forced rape of women, the beating of people, the electric shocks of people, just horrific treatment of the Uyghur people in those concentration camps. And again, something that the world should be more aware of, paying more attention to, and frankly, at every meeting with Chinese officials, there should be a conversation about, well, hey, what about the Uyghurs?
These issues are actually coming up at the State Department. I'm asking questions about the Uyghurs, about India, the persecution. But there's East Turkestan Prime Minister Salih Hudayar. I don't know if you've heard of him before, but he's been very outspoken about the Uyghurs. And from my understanding, there used to be a large Christian population in that province of China.
I don't know a lot about the history of it, but there are definitely Christian Uyghurs.
So, on to there's several other countries. Of course, there are many Muslim countries that there could be concerns about Christian persecution. What would be the top Muslim country that, specifically a Muslim country that is serious concern for Christian persecution?
I think one I would point to is Iran. It is Shia as opposed to being Sunni, but there is very intense persecution. The government is concerned, frankly, because the growth of the church. And in fact, those who study church growth say the fastest growing church in the world is in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And a part of that, and really kind of an amazing way that God has worked in Iran, is part of that leading people to pursue Christ has been the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic government. Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in 1979. He said, we are going to run our country according to Islamic principles. It is going to be as if Muhammad himself was on the throne and making the decisions. And we're now 40 years down the road, and you have an economy that is in shambles. You have one of the highest drug addiction rates in the world. You have the horrible treatment of women that we have seen in the last year. And the people of Iran are saying, if this is what it looks like to follow Islamic principles, I don't think they work. I don't think it's working. What else is out there? And so there is a hunger for the gospel. There is a hunger for some other way of doing things. And Voice of the Martyrs, lots of other ministries are helping to get Bibles in, helping to get Christian internet content in, Christian TV satellite broadcast into Iran. And it is reaping a great harvest because of the hunger of the people for something other than Islam, because they've seen their government live out Islamic principles for the last 40 years.
And finally, I think about Christian persecution, even in the U.S. Any issues there that you think that need to be addressed?
I think we certainly see the cultural winds blowing against biblical truth, blowing against gospel proclamation. I don't think we see at this point the persecution to the level that we see in the countries where Voice of the Martyrs is working in, some of those that we've talked about, China and Iran and North Korea. But we need to kind of prepare ourselves that day might be coming. As followers of Christ, that day might be coming for us. And I always encourage people, there's two ways to prepare. One is study the scripture. We should be doing that anyway. But the other is to study the lives of people who have already been persecuted. And the analogy I like, we're getting ready to come into football season here. It's one of my favorite times of the year. If I'm going to play the Patriots this Sunday, I want to watch the video of the team that beat the Patriots last Sunday. And I want to see what plays did they run? How did they do it? What worked? We can sort of study the video of persecuted Christians in this day and throughout history and look at their lives and look at their faith and look at how they live that out to see, hey, what worked in the midst of persecution? How did they stay faithful? How did they continue to spread the gospel in spite of hardship and difficulty and suffering? We can study the film and get ready so that if and when persecution does arrive in the scale that we see in other countries, in our country, we're ready to continue advancing the gospel.
Okay, you have a promotional video for Voice of the Martyrs.
We do. We have a video on our website, persecution.com.
Okay, explains it all. As you mentioned, persecution.com. I thank you for joining me, Todd, the very important issues about Christian persecution, which will hopefully, eventually, will go away, and the sooner the better.
Well, I don't know if it will, because the Lord promised us in this world you will have tribulation, but do not fear, I have overcome the world. So we can have faith and we can stand strong even in the midst of persecution.
Thank you once again for joining me on these very important issues, and hope to talk to you later.
I hope so too. Thank you for having me.
In Colombia, Rollo delivers Bibles and shares the gospel in guerrilla-controlled areas. Every time he leaves, he knows it's possible he will never come back. In Iran, Mariam smuggles Bibles to desperate Christians who have never owned their own copy of God's Word. In Nigeria, Elizabeth and her 5 children are now on their own because her husband was brutally murdered for his Christian witness. And in China, Wang Yi is serving 9 years in prison. His crime? Leading an unregistered church. These are just a few of the millions of persecuted Christians living and serving in the world's most dangerous places to follow Christ. He promised that his followers would be persecuted, and we are committed to serving them. For more than 50 years, the Voice of the Martyrs has served these bold and courageous believers by offering direct help when they face persecution, delivering Bibles to believers at any cost, and equipping frontline workers to advance the gospel. VOM also tells the stories of our persecuted brothers and sisters, which inspire other believers to pray and advance the gospel where they are. The Bible tells us to remember the prisoner as if you were in prison with them, and when one part of the body suffers, other parts of the body suffer with them. Join this global movement to support our persecuted Christian family around the world. Find out more at vom.org.